In today's business world, change is the only constant, and mastering transformation is the ultimate key to success. Welcome to Shift and Thrive. I'm your host, Natalie Nathanson. Each week, we'll bring you conversations with CEOs who delve into how they successfully drove critical change in their organization. This show is sponsored by Magnitude Consulting, bringing you the thinking power of a growth consultancy and the getting it done power of a full-service B2B marketing agency. I am really looking forward to speaking with today's guest. He is a serial entrepreneur and technology executive who spent over 25 years building companies at the intersection of IT infrastructure, cloud computing, and enterprise technology. He has founded, led, and successfully exited multiple technology companies, and through that journey has served in nearly every C-suite role, from CEO, COO, CIO, CTO, and currently Chief Revenue Officer. Along the way, he's helped scale organizations including NameSecure, Peak Hosting, SnapRoot, and most recently Sphera, the AI infrastructure company he founded before selling to BNS. Today, he's helping organizations build mission-critical infrastructure needed to power the next generation of AI. He is the Chief Revenue Officer of BNS and CEO of BNS Networks. Jon Billow, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Sorry about the technical difficulties there.
No worries, no worries. Great to have you on. And, to kick us off, given that you have built, led, and sold companies across several major technology waves, I know you've seen tons of transformation, both industry transformation as well as in the companies that you've led. So I'd love to start by talking through one of those transformations that you led, and we'll dive into what were the lessons learned. But can you start by walking us through what was the situation you were navigating?
Yeah, well, I think the reality of building a company from scratch, anybody who has a startup, there's a phrase, there's a couple of variations on a phrase, basically, that no good plan survives first enemy contact, right? And so, that kind of goes without saying for anybody who started a company, that you can come up with all these great ideas for what you want to do, and then you start talking to customers, and then you start experiencing the realities of the business, and you figure out pretty quick that you have to morph and adapt if you want to survive. So, an example, I was running a data center company for some number of years, a company called Peak Hosting. We had a very large customer concentration with a customer who, as it turns out, was very unhappy with the company, and they breached their contract. This was literally about 3 months after I started with the company. So, yay me. So we had to pivot the entire company from being a data center hosting company to basically being a consulting organization. And so that transformation was profound, both in terms of the impact on the staff, the core competencies that we needed, the way we approached the market. Every aspect of the business all of a sudden was upended and flipped on its head. So, that's probably the most extreme example I can think of, and it had a pretty significant ripple effect on everything that we did for the 3 years following that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And like you said, it really does permeate every facet of the organization. Can you talk me through how did you approach it and kind of mapping what to do immediately, kind of what to roll out over time, existing staff versus kind of new hires? What was the beginning of that process like?
I think it really started with a strategic decision with the executive team as to what approach we were going to take as far as transparency with our employees and with our customers and all the other stakeholders involved. The downside to it is not everybody is built for that, and that can bring with it an awful lot of uncertainty and scare people. And so you always have to kind of find, the fine line there between bringing people along with you through all of the sausage making, if you will, versus, holding your cards too close, and then, a lot of resentment and bad feelings about, well, why didn't leadership tell us what was going on, kind of a thing. So we made the decision, or to make a short answer long, we made the decision to err on the side of extreme transparency, and in particular with our employee base. And so, we had a fairly mature employee base, or a fairly, sophisticated employee base, that we felt like could handle it. And we felt like really that was in everybody's best interest, giving everyone, the ability to opt out if the chaos and quotient became too much. But we felt like that was the right answer. And I think in retrospect, it actually was.
Yeah. Do you have any examples that come to mind around kind of what that looked like in practice?
Yeah, so a lot of all hands meetings where we literally pulled everybody into a room and said, okay, this is the lay of the land. This is where we're at as far as, what's going on with these customers. This is where we're at as far as what we're thinking we're going to do about it. These are the unknowns. This is what it probably means to you. And by the way, we could end up having to do this all hands again 3 days from now. And everything that I told you is now different. We were a virtual company. And so we had people all over the world actually that needed to dial in and do these all hands meetings on a fairly regular cadence while we worked through some of the chaos and drama. And that was, kind of mechanically how we took care of it. There was a lot of outreach with our leadership team to make sure that there was, extra one-on-one time with folks. So, because not everybody is comfortable in kind of a company all hands to ask the question that's actually on their mind. So you have to provide people that outlet and that ability to kind of, communicate in ways that are aligned with our personalities. So, those are some of the things that we did to try and again, strike that balance between transparency and still giving people a chance to make their own decisions, knowing full well that we didn't have all the answers until the very end. We didn't have all the answers.
Yeah. A tension I often feel is kind of the balance of transparency and also like feeling responsible for kind of sharing a vision and the strategy and giving kind of that comfort level, which, fast forwarding to today, I know is hard because there is so much uncertainty in the market. So I'm curious how you think about that, right? People being comforted by wanting to know that the leadership has a clear vision, but also the transparency that a lot is changing and we don't have all the answers all the time.
Yeah, I think part of it for me is acknowledging that, some vulnerability that, yeah, people are comforted by confidence, but you can be confidently dead wrong. I worked for a guy that said, I may be wrong, but I'm never in doubt. So, there's an element to that I think is important, but I also think on balance, it is not a bad thing to be a bit vulnerable and transparent and say, hey, we don't have all the answers, especially when the environment's really dynamic and things are changing or you're concerned that they may change rapidly. It can send a real disturbing message to people when they believe that leadership is extremely confident and extremely assertive in the direction that they're going, and extremely confident and extremely assertive in the direction that they're going 180 degrees opposite 3 days later. You know, and at a certain point in time, you lose credibility with that kind of a thing. So I look at it as being, better to tell people, hey, we don't know. We're making our best guess. We're trying to figure it out. There are market forces outside of our control. There are customer behaviors outside of our control. So the whole point of the game is to shiny up your crystal ball as best you can and hope you get it right, but acknowledge that you might not all the time.
Right. I also think there's a level of empowerment that, you have to have the right culture around it, but it gives the team more opportunity to bring new ideas to help shape the vision. And so in these kind of times, I think that can be, for the right team and the right environment, that can be very empowering.
I think it is. And I also think it imbues a sense of responsibility in people too, because now they're actually part of the conversation. They're part of the dialogue. And there's, a implicit, if not explicit, invitation to be then part of the solution.
Right. One other area I want to ask you about around this transformation was the customer communications, because one thing I often experience is the customer communications are too much of an afterthought, kind of brought in too late, or kind of not enough attention around the different segments of customers and the right people, kind of delivering the right message, doing that repeatedly versus kind of one and done. So curious whether you felt that was something that went well or things you would have done differently in hindsight. Can you talk me through that?
I think it went as well as it could. That's a tougher one because, you can very much be at cross purposes in scenarios where, you kind of need to keep your customers around through the journey because they're literally the guys that are paying the bills, even if you are behind closed doors making decisions that might impact your ability to service them, or maybe taking the company in a direction that is counter to what they're interested in. Again, that's just kind of the harsh truth to it. And I think you got to find your own comfortable ground, maybe comfortable being uncomfortable, finding a compromise that's the least worst solution. I don't have a really crisp, clean answer for you there because there's so many nuances of what that might mean in a given situation that I don't know that you can be overly prescriptive about that. But I think you got to take care of your customers, of course. I always put the employees, higher on the pedestal for, order of importance there, though.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I want to shift gears a bit and talk a bit more about your leadership. And I know, I mentioned you've sat in a number of different executive seats. Um, would love to just start by asking you, how do you describe your leadership style and a bit of kind of what has shaped it?
Early in my I guess career, or after school, I enlisted in the Army. Spent 5 years in the Army Special Forces Ranger Unit, and that had a very, very impactful influence on my leadership style or my communication style. Just in general, and my personality, I feel like. And so, I'm very much a bottom line up front. You see what you get. I'm not real big on mincing words. I try and be fair and even-handed in my approach to things. I don't always succeed, but I have a very, very straightforward, kind of upfront style, I think, and that very much, goes back to the influence that I got from the service.
I was curious if there's anything you had to unlearn from kind of your time in the military, the kind of translation to the business world, because I had a guest on the podcast recently, and a lot of the conversation around kind of leading through change was around the skills that a leader needs to unlearn just as much as they need to learn. So not sure if there was anything specific to your military experience that had to shift for you.
Yeah, no, a lot of things. I mean, it's a completely different paradigm. People enlist in the service for very different reasons. As when they enter into the workforce, the commitment is dramatically different. The stakes are potentially, very different. I mean, there are some profound differences, and the expectations that you have of people are necessarily different. The way that, the hierarchy, the chain of command, the way that you have to execute in the military is dramatically different in many regards than in private sector. So, I think there's some really good foundational skills that anybody's going to get coming out of the service in terms of, organization and focus on mission and a whole bunch of other things. But I do think you have to kind of adapt your lens a little bit to understand that, it is a different scenario. People come into the workforce with very different motivations and expectations, and you really have to understand what those are, in order to, effectively motivate people. And those are not the same from company to company, by the way, but certainly not going from, military to civilian life.
Yeah, yeah. Are there any other times in your career that you experienced kind of major transformation of your own leadership?
I mean, some roles are, like when you're in operations as a COO, you tend to be more tactical. You tend to be more focusing on efficiencies and, focusing on execution models and less looking at longer term strategy, kind of from the business lens of your actual scope of responsibility. And I do think that means you have to take a different approach with your team in terms of, how to position, the roadmap and the things you're asking them to do, and how to get it done. I don't know that it necessarily, drives back into a leadership style per se, but I do think that in some senses those are difficult to extract from one another. If I'm spending all my day thinking about what the product roadmap is going to be 10 years from now, and then having to have my team focusing on things like that, it's a very different kind of, modeling than if I'm literally focusing on, how do I make sure that we have a 4% efficiency improvement and execution, month over month kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So more about the current hat that you're wearing rather than kind of the leadership style itself.
I think that there's sort of core principles to leadership that are going to transcend all of that. Um, you know, in terms of how you're holding people accountable, how you motivate people, and things like that. But I do think that there's an adaptation to that that's important based on the lens that you're looking at it through.
And, speaking a bit more about that lens, because I know you have sat in, numerous executive seats. Are there areas that you find, CEOs often misunderstand in some of those other functions because they haven't personally kind of sat in that seat?
The team itself, there's a whole framing with teamwork that you have to go through. The forming, storming, norming, performing kind of a cycle, and you really can't shortchange that. And so, as you are a CEO and you have a newly formed team where you may not necessarily have gone through that journey, you may not necessarily have that trust. You're going to have to figure out how to basically, either develop the trust very, very rapidly, blindly trust, or come up with some kind of inspection framework if you don't have it, especially if it's in a subject area where you don't have that personal experience. It can be a little bit challenging. So I do think that there's a definite, you know, again, it's very different if you're coming from a startup mentality or a startup where you have, two guys in a garage that are forming the company and you're organically growing it. You bracket those things in as you grow. And so it becomes much more of an organic kind of a thing. And in theory, you have time to figure out that team dynamic and that trust dynamic and the roles and responsibilities. It's a lot harder if you're kind of, airdropped into to an organization that already exists, and you may never have held one of those positions before. You don't know the team. You've got to figure some of those things out differently.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk a bit about the go-to-market side of things. And there was something you said when we last spoke. We were talking about fast-moving markets and that kind of building that perfect go-to-market plan can be a bit of a fool's errand. Can you talk a bit about how you approach go-to-market in fast-changing markets, which I would argue is most markets these days?
You have to put a stake in the ground, and you have to approach your market with something that you believe is going to work based on the market research you've done and whatever the product market fit is that you believe you have, and there are all the other aspects of how you build a strategy. But then you got to take a look at the reality of it. You got to put the metrics in place. You got to make sure that you have the ability to measure and inspect as you go. And you've got to be willing to let go of things. You got to be able to take a look at things in a clear-eyed manner and say, okay, this isn't working. Why is it not working? Is it not working because we haven't done it correctly? Is it not working because we haven't given it enough time? Is it not working because it's not going to work? And that's that's that sort of polishing your crystal ball thing again, right? Because you generally don't know until too late when you've been pursuing something for too long, and it's a losing strategy. There obviously a lot of Silicon Valley has got kind of that fail fast kind of mentality to things, and I do generally think that there's a good amount of value to that. You just got to be careful that you don't whipsaw the organization, in such a dramatic fashion that people don't really know what they're doing.
Hey, this is Natalie, your Shift and Thrive host. After chatting with lots of CEOs, one thing is crystal clear. Leveling up your company means having a killer go-to-market strategy. That's what my crew at Magnitude Consulting does every day. If you're trying to step up your marketing game, whether it's strategizing, accelerating your pipeline, expanding into new markets, or getting into AI and automation, let's talk. No pitch, no pressure, just good conversation. Visit shiftandthrivepodcast.com/Natalie to schedule a time. Can't wait to connect. Right. And I think that kind of whiplash approach, I think often about patience and what is kind of the right sized amount of patience to give a certain initiative or direction before figuring out if it's working or not. And I think oftentimes I do see companies giving up too quickly, or maybe the execution wasn't as strong as it could have been, and so blaming the kind of the tactic or the approach versus the other way around. Curious if there are any examples or insights you have about, right, how do you find that balance that you're not waiting too long, but you're also not kind of throwing in the towel prematurely.
Well, when software development world anyway, you talk about a minimally viable product, right? So you go with kind of the bare bones of what you think it is that the market is looking for, and that's what you build, and not one iota more than that, because anything more than that, and you're already, by definition of the term, you're already going beyond what the market minimally needs in order to, give you that feedback on the product. So once you get to that point, I think you really should get into more of an iterative model where you're actually soliciting customer feedback one way or the other and measuring, what the reaction is that the market is telling you with their pocketbook about how well you've built your widget. So, I do think that that's really important, and having those metrics identified up front. The worst thing I think you can do is develop something without having the measurement, KPIs defined, and without defining what success and defining what failure are going to look like. You got to do that up front. You may want to revisit it, but you've got to at least put that stake in the ground up front, because the first thing that goes out the window is objectivity. And, you'll develop this thing, and now you're invested in it. And now you are going to look at it and kind of go, well, if we just turn it 15 degrees to the left, I'm sure it'll sell this time. Or, wow, if we just paint it blue rather than yellow, I'm sure it'll sell this time. So I actually think that you got to be, there may be a scenario where people give up too soon. There may be a scenario where people, stick with it too long. But I would maybe argue that that comes back to the same core issue, which is, you're not defining your success and failure criteria up front, and you're not putting the harness in place to measure it along the way, so that if if you're clear-eyed and objective about it, you know, harder to delude yourself if you've got that framework built.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's very smart, and like you said, something that then everyone can look back to and point back to, and even if those definitions shift, that becomes a deliberate decision that you're making. And like they use the term kind of MVP in that context, because I often talk about kind of minimally viable go-to-market strategy. And I think some folks think of, go-to-market consulting that my company does, and think of, 6 months and a giant plan and kind of over architecture of all the inputs that by the time you finish it, you're kind of need to be right back where you started. But I think oftentimes it's, needing to make sure you have clarity on your positioning, your differentiation, the customer pain points, but then like move very quickly into action against that. So it's kind of that balance of what are the convictions you need to have in place and have that grounded in kind of the realities of the market. But then don't spend too long making it perfect. Just get going and get the reaction of the market.
Yeah, I think there are obvious exceptions to that. I don't think most people have the Steve Jobs kind of clarity of vision of, I'm not going to ask you what you want, I'm going to tell you what you need, and I'm going to just damn the torpedoes, build it. And Steve Jobs almost went out of business many times in his career, so it is a very risky, approach to take that kind of, that kind of strategy. So I don't actually think most people are cut out for that, and I don't know that it works for the most part. I do think you have to take that kind of, reflective, kind of iterative approach, and see what people tell you.
I want to talk a bit about kind of customer proximity, and I believe you're in a very channel heavy environment currently. So just want to hear, like, how do you keep the organization kind of close enough to the customers, close enough to the channel, given some of those relationships are being managed kind of one step removed?
Well, we're really close to it. I mean, we have to be, because at the end of the day, it's not a scenario like in a classic product where we're selling to a distribution channel and we lose visibility to, the transaction downstream from that. I mean, we are a services business. We are building products and developing services on, for an end customer. and the requirements are coming from that customer. The end product is something that they have a high degree of interaction with us around. So, the fact that we're doing it through a channel, um, in some ways is the worst of both worlds, because it means that we are a bit at arm's length from kind of a commercial term perspective with customers. And in some cases means that requirements and input comes, by way of a proxy and has to be translated. And that can bring friction and it can bring delays into the process. But we're close enough to it that we damn sure hear about it if there are any disconnects in what we built versus what they wanted. So, we have almost instantaneous feedback, from the end consumer of what we build, such that we have a very tight feedback loop there. Like I said, in our case, it's a little bit of the worst of both worlds. We get all that feedback, but we're not necessarily able to control, the sales motion up until that point, because we're coming at it with a channel in the middle there.
Want to talk a little bit about an AI, because I know you're using it internally, but also helping your customers kind of build, the solutions or infrastructure that helps to support them in that ecosystem. So want to hear, I guess first, just a little bit about how are you looking at it and thinking about it as far as kind of the internal use?
Well, it's a tool like everything else, and we use it in that context. So for every aspect of the organization, there is an appropriate use case where AI can basically help with efficiencies. We're not in a scenario where I cannot conceive of a scenario where anybody loses their job in our company because of AI. It's something that augments and it's something that streamlines and improves the quality of job functions and what it is that we do. But it's never going to be a thing that I can envision where it would replace people. Just the nature of our business and what we do, I don't think it's very conducive to that. So I in particular really champion the use of AI at every level within every job function, basically from the perspective of, look, use it to do all the grunt work, use it to do all the research, use it to fill out the vendor form, use it to reconcile your cash forecast, use it to figure out who your competitors are in the industry. Use it to figure out, where your bottlenecks were in your production pipeline. I mean, all those kinds of things that people have to do anyway. It's just a way to, in general, optimize and make that a little bit more efficient. So internally, that's how we're using it. We use it literally in every aspect of the business to a greater or lesser extent, for those reasons. If nothing else, just as an external sounding board to basically see if there's anything creative and unique that AI comes back and tells us that maybe we hadn't thought of. Well, it's a cheap insurance policy, if nothing else, even if that's all it's being used for. Externally is a different scenario. The nature of what we do is that we are building the AI infrastructure that most of the world is leveraging, either from a consumer perspective or from a Frontier Labs perspective. We're the physical layer build guys. So we're in there with the electricians and the plumbers and the ladders and the screwdrivers, and we're physically putting the environment together and getting it, optimized and then handed back to the end customer. So, from kind of a external business facing angle on it, it is a big part of what we do and where we play in the world. And then, the consumer end of it is as I mentioned.
Hmm. How much does it matter, what the customer has, kind of their full kind of strategy and vision laid out at the outset versus kind of that is kind of changing as it unfolds?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a difficult one because it's moving so fast, that I don't think most people really know what they are going to need or how they're going to use it until they get involved with it. And the challenge that brings, that is a very capital intense exercise. And so,
Right.
if you can't tell me what you're going to use it for or what you might be wanting to do with it, 3 years from now, it's going to be hard for me to tell you that the infrastructure we build will support, a 3-year use case. But then again, if we look back at where we were 3 years ago with AI, nobody would have predicted we are where we are now. So I don't know that anybody's getting too wrapped around the axle on that, because it's kind of been an impossible thing to answer. I mean, put it this way, I'm actually in Paris right now at a big AI conference, and one of the panelists today was asked, where do you think you're going to be in a year? And he just kind of laughed and said, a year is an eternity for us. I mean, I can't predict that. I have absolutely no idea, right? So that's been one thing that AI really has done, is kind of shorten everybody's event horizon to, what long range planning is. I mean, once upon a time, a million years ago, we would put together 5 year strategic plans. Okay, well, that's fairly laughable at this point, right? Especially, if you're in my industry, a 6 month strategic plan, yeah, maybe that might be even pushing it a little bit, but yeah, it's a long winded answer to your question, but it's not really terribly relevant, to be honest with you, where people think they're going to be in the long term, because the ground is shifting and evolving so fast that nobody can possibly really make intelligent guesses around that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I was laughing a bit when you were talking about the 5 year timelines, the 6 month timelines, because it's so true. And we operate on EOS and have a number of clients on that use that as well. And a lot of the like planning disciplines there just feel laughable. At the same time, right, there needs to be something to replace that with, and like having that clear pulse on the landscape, revisiting kind of annual plans or quarterly plans more frequently.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, and I also think you just need to kind of understand that things are changing and we don't know where it's going to go. And so, be careful of building too much into your overall strategy around, effectively a product that's being developed as we speak, right? The only cautionary thing I would say is, if you don't know, don't bake it too deep into your strategy, because you get a really nasty surprise.
John, I'd love to shift gears a bit and love all the things that you've shared with us, and would love to hear a bit more about you. You talked a bit about your military background, but tell me a bit about your childhood. Who was little John, and did you have a sense you'd kind of end up with the kind of career you have today?
I've always had a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, I was a kid in middle school who was like, selling my peanut butter and jelly and swapping it for a cupcake, and then selling the cupcake for a Pop Tart, kind of a thing in the lunchroom. So I think that kind of came through pretty clearly from a real young age. How that got channeled obviously had a lot to do with the rest of my life, but I grew up in rural New Jersey. My family, raised and trained horses, and I kind of had that in my DNA. We moved to California when I was in high school, and I met my wife when we were there, and we started some companies and flipped them, and have some kids, and decided we wanted to move back to my roots. So we picked up and moved to Oregon 26 years ago, mostly because I wanted my kids to have that same, experience that I did in living kind of rural life, and being exposed to rural values, and developing a strong physical work ethic. Those were really foundational for me growing up. I spent a lot more time outdoors than indoors. This was obviously way before cell phones, and it's kind of crazy if I look back on it now, and certainly look back at my parenting style with my kids. But my mom had absolutely no idea where I was for 12 hours of the day, because I was off running around in the woods. And I think that was real important for me, based on my personality. I don't know what the hell would I would have ended up in jail if I'd been lived in any other kind of circumstance, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, so it was important to me to provide those kinds of opportunities for my kids when I started a family, and I think that served my family well. And everybody's different, but I guess I just got lucky that my upbringing and my environment kind of matched my personality, and I think was fairly, I think with everybody, but helped get me where I am today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's wonderful. So thank you for sharing that. And as we get ready to wrap up, I'd love to ask the question that I ask every guest, and that is, what's the best piece of advice you've been given that still sticks with you today?
I can't remember who gave me this bit of advice, but you know, get comfortable being uncomfortable is is very, very true for my career. I think it's probably true for anybody at any stage in their career. If they want to keep pace with, what's going on in the world, things are moving at an increasing velocity, compared with where they were, in years past. And I think if you can get into that mindset where you're not going to know it all, you're not going to have it all figured out. What you wake up to tomorrow is going to be different than today, and you can be okay with that. I think that adaptability is critically important for the world that we're in, and what I expect we're going to be in for the foreseeable future. So that would be my advice.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And as we wrap up today's conversation, can you let listeners know how they can get in touch?
Yeah. So our website is boldnew.com. DNS is how we go by. So that's probably the easiest way. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't do the Twitter thing. I certainly don't do the TikTok thing. So website and LinkedIn and email is Jon, Jon at boldnew.com. Those are the best options.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jon. I loved hearing so much of what you shared in the conversation around your leadership, some of the lessons learned from the change management and the different areas where that has shown up throughout your career. So thank you so much for everything you shared.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good talking to you.
You as well. And thank you too to everyone who's listening. If today's conversation sparked something for you, and I'm sure that it did, please pass this along to another leader. We know that insights like this fuel fresh thinking for each of us and help us drive real transformation in our companies and in ourselves. So thank you again, Jon. And this has been another wonderful conversation on Shift and Thrive. I'll see you all next time. So I just finished recording a great conversation with Jon Billow on my podcast. And one part that really stuck with me was around the conversation we had around planning in fast-moving markets, which frankly I think is most markets these days, just given AI and geopolitics and just a lot happening in the world of business. And I know a lot of CEOs are feeling this right now because I'm having these conversations every day, that the old planning rhythms just don't fit the same way that they used to. And, even a 12-month plan can feel a bit fictitious at times because of the pace of change. However, I don't think the answer is let's stop planning. I think it really just needs to be around how do we plan differently and what that looks like. And in my world around go-to-market, I see companies falling into one of two traps. One is spending too long to try to build the perfect plan or get every small component, perfectly right. The other is moving so quickly that they skip the foundations. And frankly, I do see more in that latter camp. And I know the temptation of skipping foundations is that, you have revenue numbers to hit. You want to get things out in the market and start building pipeline. The reality is neither of these approaches works particularly well. What's really important is making sure you have the right strategic foundations and inputs. And so that means having clarity on who you're targeting, what is the pain point you're solving, how are you meaningfully different from other solutions in the market? What is the market already telling you, right? What do you know from customers, partners, lost opportunities, et cetera? And then having a strong conviction or hypothesis around what you believe is going to work for your go-to-market motions, and treating that as what it is, a hypothesis, not a monument. So getting things into the market, testing, listening, adjusting, learning, and using that to continue to inform your go-forward plan. There's also one thing that Jon said in that conversation that I really liked, and that is really making sure you define success and failure criteria up front. Because once you're in motion and have a new initiative underway, it's that much harder to be objective about it. So yes, move fast, but don't confuse moving fast with skipping the strategy. And really in the uncertainty in the market that, virtually every company is facing right now, the goal is not to build a perfect plan. It's to build a smart enough plan that allows you to move, measure, learn, and adapt and keep pace with the market for your success and for that of your clients. That's a wrap for this week's episode. For show notes and more, visit shiftandthrivepodcast.com. A special thank you to our sponsor, Magnitude Consulting. bringing you the thinking power of a growth consultancy and the getting it done power of a full-service marketing agency to help B2B companies fuel their growth. For more information on Magnitude and to get your complimentary transformation readiness assessment, visit magnitudeconsulting.com/getready. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.